As summer faded into autumn across the British Isles, an economic storm was brewing, one with profound implications for the nation's central bank mandarins, its freshly minted Labour government, and the very trajectory of the United Kingdom itself. At the vortex of this squall were the humblest yet most vital elements of any modern economy: wages. Recent data from the venerable recruitment firm Reed cast an unsettling light on pay growth trends, raising thorny questions that cut to the core of Britain's economic hopes and challenges. These latest findings encapsulate the competing forces buffeting British workers, corporations, and policymakers as they strive to navigate unpredictable currents and chart a steady course. For Andrew Bailey, the Polish governor of the Bank of England tasked with maintaining the nation's monetary equilibrium, the Reed revelations could not have come at a more inopportune moment. Just weeks after the central bank's August rate-setting committee opted to trim borrowing costs from a 16-year peak, evidence emerged that the wage landscape was shifting treacherously underfoot. The recruitment data laid bare an arresting reversal. After an extended stretch of decelerating pay growth across job advertisements nationwide, recent months witnessed an unmistakable upswing, with the crucial 3-month measure touching its zenith for all of 2024 in the period ended July. This threw a wrench into the central bank's carefully calculated plans. The monetary mavens had justified last month's interest rate cut by pointing to the very trends that now appeared to be unwinding: a moderation in the relentless upward march of worker compensation. If firms were indeed nudging salaries higher once more, that risked stoking inflationary fires barely banked. For Bailey and his coterie of rate-setters, who had hailed tentative signs of a cool-down in pay pressures, this raised the specter of being forced to apply the monetary brakes afresh. Wage acceleration filtering into official data could compel the bank to move cautiously on any further easing, lest it stoke a wage price spiral that could imperil its cherished inflation target. Yet the wage quandary extended well beyond the citadel of Threadneedle Street. For Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his ascendant Labour reformers, raised on the crucible of the opposition benches and buoyed by their stunning general election triumph, the Reed wage findings underscored the obstacles confronting their grand economic ambitions. Starmer, armed with a sweeping mandate for change after over a decade of conservative stagnation, had promised nothing less than to rekindle British growth to levels not witnessed since the halcyon Blair era. His vision entailed elevating the nation's sputtering annual expansion rate to a robust 2.5%, an audacious goal that would require mobilizing every untapped reserve of labor across the realm. Yet the Reed data hinted at the enormity of that undertaking. For even as renewed wage pressures signal a degree of economic vibrancy, the byproduct of firms sweetening comp packages to attract scarce talent, they also betokened an endemic mismatch between labor supply and demand. As James Reed, the eponymous chief executive of the storied recruitment outfit, explained, "Our data shows that wage growth is happening in sectors with persistent skill shortages that also demand in-person attendance, such as construction, engineering, education, and hospitality." In plainer terms, Britain's very prosperity hinged on its ability to mint more plumbers, builders, teachers, and baristas in the years ahead, lest sectors starved for human capital be forced to perpetually bid up wages, fueling the inflationary fires the Bank of England so ardently sought to extinguish. Whilst persistent wage inflation is not helpful for the BOE, it is symptomatic of a more profound structural problem which will be unhelpful for the new Labour government, given that it has prioritized economic growth, Reed cautioned. The problem will be finding the workers to do the growing. Reckoning with that reality would prove a crucible for the fledgling Labour regime. Having railed for years against Tory fealty to austerity and stagnation, Starmer and his cabinet would now be forced to conjure up ambitious, potentially revolutionary, solutions to correct Britain's human capital deficiencies, all while staying true to Labour's cherished social justice ethos of uplifting the working class. For Britain's workforce, the wage crosscurrents carried their own whiplash effects. As the scars of 2022's blistering inflation faded, an entire generation witnessed their pay packets shriveling in real terms as spiraling costs outstripped income gains. There was hope in the early data that the bitter pill of eroded earnings could be reversed as rampant price growth abated and firms recalibrated payrolls upward. Yet the autumn 2024 bounce in advertised salaries, while encouraging for future paychecks, also signaled the possibility of tighter monetary policy returning to counter any inflationary resurgence. This acted as a sobering reminder that simply enjoying a raise was no guarantee of higher living standards in an era of unpredictable interest rates and economic zigs and zags. The implications radiated through every precinct of British life. For legions of graduates shaping their careers, the prospect of seesawing wages and inflation injected an unwelcome instability into household budgeting and major life decisions like buying homes or starting families. For time-strapped professionals in lucrative but body-clock-defying fields like law, consulting, and investment banking, the Reid findings potentially validated a long-term premium on their grueling schedules. After all, employers willing to dangle fatter paychecks were acknowledging the fierce competition for those able to endure the sapping lifestyle demands of such vocations in a tight labor market. Stalwart office drones and shop floor rats hoping for steady salary progression faced an equally uncertain calculus. Would the modest income gains validated by Reid herald the long-awaited restoration of their eroded purchasing power? Or would rotating bouts of pay stagnation and price spikes permanently impair their generational prospects? For beleaguered pensioners subsisting on fixed incomes, the wage dynamics were equally destabilizing, altering the contours of retirement planning and straining social safety nets. Retirees increasingly faced the grim arithmetic of inflation devaluing their savings while pay increases for the still employed stoked cost of living pressures across the entire economy. In short, the wage trends distilled the essence of Britain's economic crossroads in concentrated form. They evinced the delicate balance policymakers must strike to foster growth and prosperity without igniting inflationary brushfires. They reflected both the crippling worker shortages that threatened to enfeeble key industries and the desperation of firms to lure talent at potentially ruinous costs. Most poignantly, the pay currents laid bare the whipsawing anxieties afflicting everyday Britons striving for financial security amidst dizzying economic vicissitudes. For the archetypal British worker, pay and prices had become a cruel, unpredictable dance partner, one that remorselessly jerked their living standards back and forth between privation and fleeting abundance. While the data covered the entire nation, it was the capital that served as the crucible for these clashing impulses. London, that centuries-old hub of finance and commerce, offered a microcosm of both Britain's economic tribulations and the tantalizing hopes for revival. In the city, the heartbeat of British capital markets, pinstripe-suited bankers and traders absorbed the wage fluctuations through the prism of their Bloomberg terminals and derivatives pricing models. The upward drift in pay scales for professional services was a harbinger of higher operational costs and slimmer profit margins in the years ahead. This at a moment when global volatility had already buffeted the square miles fortunes. Some financiers adopted a more sanguine outlook, trusting that renewed compensation pressures signaled elevated activity and profitability that could more than offset incremental labor costs. Others harbored dimmer assessments, fearing that the British economy was drifting into the same inflationary morass that had plagued the 1970s. That stagnant era offered a chilling precedent for how soaring wages could erode corporate performance and stifle deal-making. Just blocks from the hallowed byways of Britain's banking core, the baristas and clerks serving London's white-collar workforce confronted more visceral calculations. For many of these modestly paid service staffers, the wage figures laid bare an unvarnished desperation underlying their employers' pay practices. The Reid data showed hospitality and catering roles experiencing the sharpest spikes in advertised salaries, with increases north of 30% over the preceding year as the July-September period reached its zenith. Whether pulling pints at a city watering hole or manning the counters at a Pret-a-Manger, these were the very sectors crying out for human capital. For the youthful students and ambitious immigrants who frequently filled such ranks, these astronomical compensation increases held the tantalizing prospect of finally achieving financial buoyancy and consumer-class respectability. After years of kowtowing to London's punishing cost of living to scrape by on subsistence wages, perhaps a tighter labor pool would at last elevate their economic station and deliver on the unwritten promise of social mobility. Yet the insecurity and precariousness endemic to service sector toil injected skepticism into such fantasies. Even as signing bonuses and enhanced hourly rates flooded hiring advertisements, would such ephemeral bids merely evaporate once the staffing crisis passed? In an industry notorious for high job turnover, what prevented employers from retreating into old patterns of underpaying their workforce once the depleted ranks were replenished? Such suspicions mirrored the overarching distrust of establishment institutions that had slowly metastasized through modern Britain, fueling upheavals from Brexit to the labor landslide. For service workers hardened by years of being nickel-and-dimed, the siren song of fatter paychecks could never be disentangled from the realities of their standing as an exploited proletariat underclass, perpetually at the mercy of management's whims. Indeed, for every Pollyanna dreaming of hourly wage nirvana, There were doubters who saw the wage frenzy as the latest mirage deployed to ensnare vulnerable workers into contingent, temporary arrangements, all to meet acute staffing shortfalls before the impetus for higher pay evaporated. Across London's innumerable hostels and grotty flatshares, hushed conversations weighed the merits of corporate promises against the sobering inevitability of being cast aside once hiring needs had abated. If the city represented Britain's brain trust of capital and enterprise, closer inspection revealed a parallel universe of anxiety and deprivation thrumming just underneath. Whether staffing automated checkout queues or hawking street-level snacks, London's army of invisible workers fueled the metropolis's consumerist metabolism. Many eked out bare subsistence wages while enabling their wealthier counterparts' ostentatious lifestyles. Yet even for this regiment of society's indispensable laborers, the wage pendulum had swung with enough force to briefly elevate their hopes of climbing into affluence. Beyond the cloistered environs of banks and bodegas, London's ethnically kaleidoscopic neighborhoods offered innumerable variations on this theme. From the African matriarchs tending tidy convenience shops, to the minicab drivers perpetually haunting the West End, to the shipment warehouse crews shouldering Britain's burgeoning e-commerce boom, all calibrated potential earnings through the prism of inflationary pressures and labor scarcities. For South Asians stewarding family-owned newsagents or manning neighborhood off-licenses, the advertised wage growth rekindled ancestral ambitions of transcending the petite bourgeoisie ranks. If the right pay escalations persisted across skilled trades like plumbing or construction, perhaps their progeny could leverage this bounteous moment to fully ascend into Britain's professional strata, simultaneously preserving the cultural legacies of the subcontinent while partaking in the privileges of Western prosperity. Such aspirations echoed through the affordable housing estates ringing London's periphery, where Polish and Romanian cleaners, builders and laborers sought economic redemption. Decades after first arriving to slake Britain's insatiable thirst for foreign manual labor, these working-class immigrants and their British-born children scrutinized wage trends as potential pathways to the enduring British dream of home ownership and middle-class security. On park benches and at suburban transport hubs, men gathered to pore over circulars from temping agencies, weighing escalating pay rates against the grueling tolls of long-haul trucking gigs or punishing construction schedules. For those inured to the privations of London's outer edges, the prospect of fatter paychecks elevated engulfed fantasies of one day escaping the soulless high-rise estates for the comfort of home village life back in Eastern Europe. If only pay scales maintained their upward trajectory, perhaps they could repatriate with enough of a nest egg to secure modest middle-class status an ocean away. Across Britain's Arcadian countryside, from the thatched industrial towns of the Midlands to the austere villages sculpting the Yorkshire Dales, wages represented both economic lifeline and cultural tether. On the crenellated factory floors of Birmingham's manufacturing revivals, wage trends were studied for portents of whether the line worker's role would remain viable in an era of automation and globalization. Stable, generation-spanning pay progressions could secure these proud industrial revolution cities' very existential identities. Further north, the splendid, if faded fishing villages lining Britain's craggier coastlines contemplated the wage crosscurrents from an entirely distinct vantage. Here, decade upon decade of hemorrhaging population and economic vitality to more prosperous corners of the realm had whittled communities to pale shadows. Wage stagnation represented a cultural death knell, an augur of the last generation being bled dry before proud nautical traditions winked permanently into history. The resilient family inns, chippas and boathouses that persevered in these windswept exurban redoubts clung to pipe dreams of revitalization, of wealthy Johnsons rediscovering these forsaken seaside idols and bidding up wages lavishly to lure back labor forces. For struggling townships from Whitby to Lyme Regis, escalating pay scales offered the tantalizing prospect of revival and rebirth, of recapturing some economic glint of their former glory. In this manner, the wage dynamics exercised a reach that extended far beyond pounds and pence, transcending mere economic analysis to existential questions of national identity and cultural preservation. For in the United Kingdom, more than most lands, the localized patriotisms and parochial pride lent any fluctuation in worker compensation a degree of metaphysical and civilizational significance. These currents had already shaped British history in indelible ways over the preceding decades and centuries. The cataclysmic deindustrialization sweeping core production centers during the 1980s represented more than manufacturing decline. It was the systemic fraying of entire societal ethos and cultural mooring for communities culturally defined by their gritty industrial character. Wages plunging into freefall precipitated the dissolution of mining villages and factory towns with the concentrated devastation of a neutron bomb. More recently, Britain's spasms of uneven wage growth and regional stratification had fueled disruptive populist upheavals. The siren pull of metropolitan professions underpinned a brain drain, sucking human capital from post-industrial towns into the thrumming urban cores, leaving stagnant resentment in its wake. These senses of being left behind nourished the Brexit backlash that rent the nation's very fabric. Economic dislocation and anger over stagnating pay in downtrodden districts powered a furious rejection of Britain's established order. Similarly, as inflation and moribund earnings growth immiserated the working and middle classes in the 2010s, frustration over this impairment of living standards metastasized into the seething backlash that swept Keir Starmer's resurgent Workers' Party to power. Fed up with a decade-plus of fiscal rectitude that constrained pay progression, voters embraced Labour's unapologetically Keynesian credo of priming the economic pump to resuscitate advancement and mobility. It remained to be seen whether Starmer's revolution would succeed in reigniting wage momentum to fulfill his promises of national reinvigoration. But for the Prime Minister's administration, the impetus to resolve Britain's sclerotic pay problems was existential, a matter of shoring up their government's very philosophical mandata and raison d'etre. Such was the portentous significance of the wage dilemma roiling British economic discourse. At its crux lay nothing less than the essence of the nation's self-identity, its claims to greatness, its existential stratification between London's vertiginous prosperity and the perpetual deprivations afflicting its more forsaken quarters. Workers languishing on meager wages constituted more than economic statistics. They represented millions of souls in suspended ambition and advancement, entire generations sublimating dreams of financial security. Rising compensation emblematized not just purchasing power but dignity, the fulfillment of the intangible British covenants of self-improvement and meritocracy. For the overeducated barista or the unappreciated code monkey, fatter paychecks represented deliverance from the psychic purgatory of stunted growth. In this light, the wage patterns charted by Reed Recruitment crystallized the very stakes of 21st-century Britain's ongoing quest to recapture its fading relevance on the world stage. Would spiraling pay be the rising tide lifting all boats to newfound prosperity? Or would it trigger a damaging wage price spiral, requiring draconian austerity that could squander Starmer's ambitious growth agenda before it began? For central bank chiefs like Bailey at Threadneedle Street, restraining private sector pay became the preeminent challenge for managing inflation and economic stability. Yet doing so risked constraining the very income growth necessary to revitalize depressed communities and make Starmer's vision a reality. This fundamental tension, between fostering revived prosperity through higher wages and controlling those same pay pressures to preserve monetary stability, encapsulated the Hobson's choice confronting Britain's policymaking elite. It was the quintessential example of the devilish economic dilemmas demanding enlightened governance in an ambiguous, multivariable world. In the granular experiences of everyday Britons lay the human dimension defying sterile modeling and reminding all of the existential stakes. The pensioner in Hartlepool stretching depleted retirement funds ever thinner as wages escalated around them. The Brummie assembly line worker gambling their livelihood on whether plants would shutter or thrive under new labor costs. The Essex City trader wondering if their £1,000,000 bonus might be imperiled by wage-induced profit erosion. For all, the cold wage data represented human lives and cosmic dreams hanging in the balance. Past generations bent their energies to eking out maximums from meager pay. Now their legatees closely tracked labor metrics anticipating whether they'd transcend the limitations of hereditary class. Strong pay growth augured bright futures of ample consumption and disposable income. Stagnation foreshadowed more dashed hopes and repressed yearnings. From the playing fields of Eton to the teeming flat shares of Elephant and Castle, all experienced the wage quandary in visceral form. It seeped ineluctably into intimate conversations and interpersonal psychodramas. Would my wages ascend enough to keep spouse and I in our beloved family home as retirement beckons? If I dedicate myself to my entry-level position with punishing hours, will ample pay increases render those sacrifices worthwhile? Should we embark on that pricey fertility regimen when cost of living is spiraling and pay gains remain elusive? For all the abstractions of wage growth modeling and the detached Jesuitry of inflation abatement, pay comprised the raw material sustaining British family units in their timeless aspirations, the cozy household, the annual holiday by the shore, the funds to ensure the children more opportunities than we ourselves inherited. It was these vignettes of domesticity and intergenerational longing, distilled into column after column of impersonal wage statistics that lent the economic debate its beating human heart. Data on salaries were but a cipher for the innumerable human destinies hanging in the balance of confounding policy trade-offs weighing on policymakers from London to Lancashire. Ultimately, beyond the Byzantine complexities and internecine wrangling over interest rate adjustments, the wage discourse embodied eternal human frailties and enduring yearnings. Fear of impoverishment and privation, dreams of transcending one's station through sweat and ceaseless striving, pride in scaling life's ziggurat, purchasing that larger homestead for one's clan, acquiring the status-bearing markers of membership in the bourgeois classes. In this timeless facet, little had changed over the eons separating Britain's economic condition from the agrarian struggles of Chaucer's serfs or the upwardly mobile strivings of Victorian factory fortunes. Wages distilled the primal aspiration for security and attainment that has buoyed the collective human psyche since time immemorial. Whether debated as sterile statistics or contemplated as the delicate arithmetic underpinning family dreams, the wage story inscribed the latest chapter in a primordial narrative. It tapped into endless wells of yearning, resentment, ambition, and uncertainty bubbling eternally beneath the surface of daily living. So even as politicians, mandarins, and mavens dissected the latest earnings data with forensic zeal, their abstract machinations represented something far more profound and elemental. For beneath the veneer of technocratic policy formulations existed entire galaxies of human striving, generations of ancestors whose sacrifices had paved the way for Britons to even entertain such lofty debates about labor economics and income mobility. The very tradition of sober national discourses pondering wage progressions as barometers of societal health was itself an hallmark of British distinctiveness, of a people who had marinated in these fraught questions of economic security and meritocracy until such preoccupations became woven into their cultural fabric. From the hallowed sanctums of Cambridge and Oxford, where aristocratic scions and scholarship boys alike chewed over the moral philosophies of equitable compensation, to the rancid Fleet Ditch confines where Jack of the Turnpike bent his back hauling freight without expectation of upward trajectory, these differing experiences coalesced into a peculiarly British fixation on the centrality of wages, work, and advancement. It was a perspective at once mercantile and metaphysical, fusing the merchant's unsentimental appraisal of human capital expenditures with a more mystical veneration of labor as the secular apotheosis of human endeavor. An ethos proclaiming that one's wages were the temporal yardstick measuring the immortal wages of sin. This mingling of the earthy and the exalted lent the discourse over pay packets a transcendent significance within the annals of British civilization. Not for naught had Karl Marx propped his feet on London coffee tables as he reverse-engineered capitalism's inner contradictions. Nor had the industrial upheavals of Victorian soot and textile towns failed to rearrange human consciousness regarding the meaning of toil. Even now, as fintech disruption remolded the very nature of labor yet again, these immemorial debates over wages cut to the marrow of Britain's tortured relationship with modernity and capital. And so the economic tumult over the Reid recruitment data represented an inescapable grappling not just with inflation and unemployment projections, but with the primordial essence of the British condition. Labor and wages constituted the warp and weft of the nation's communal fabric, the chords eternally strummed in the national psychodrama spanning peasant uprisings, colonial plunder, blitzkrieg, and Blairite boom. Did the Reid findings portend a welcome reversal of prolonged immiseration? Or did they augur a vicious new pay-price spiral, condemning Britons to a fresh turn on history's cruelest of wheels? For those sworn to navigate such existential crossroads, the steeplechase would demand every infinitesimal increment of statecraft and discernment. To the everyman toilers, however, the stakes were far more elemental. Would the current portend sustenance or sustain privation? Could my brood's immemorial longing for more finally be requited in this new dawn of plump wages? Or would our mortal enterprise remain mired, the cliff's edge just beyond tantalizing grasp? It was to these universal yearnings that the wage discourse rallied its deepest emotional resonance, elucidating the intractable ways in which financial security remains the Archimedean point upon which all human frictions and contentments shift their weighty balances. For generations stretching into antiquity, the elemental duel between capital and labor had echoed across British fields, factories, and foundries. Now that most primordial of dramas was rekindled, its latest battle pitched on the terrain of whether wages must rise or fall in service of inflation mastery, revived growth, or something more elusive, a restoration of national euthymia and collective selfhood. To Andrew Bailey and Keir Starmer befell the unenviable responsibility of choreographing the production's latest spasms. Central husbandry and legislative zeal would intermingle in determining the next choreographies of appreciation and abnegation, of which segments of the British fabric were rewarded through higher pay, and which were constrained to uphold fiscal temperance. Yet even as these masters of the economic universe fiddled with their policy levers and output gaps, a more subterranean impulse lurked in the gathering gloom. For the denouement would be decided through infinitely more profound emanations, the roiling subconscious yearnings of a nation still groping to redefine its place amidst the spheres of globalism and diminishing insularity. At base, the wage debate crystallized anxieties over preserving some inimitable essence of Britishness itself, that elusive brine of cultural peculiarities, defiant insularities and civilizational preeminence curdled over a millennium upon the rain-lashed shoals of Albion. What distinguished John Bull and his inheritors from the quotidian human anthropologies? An ethos extolling respectable reticence and phlegmatic reserve, a consummately evolved idiom of socio-economic stratification, a sportsman's sense of fairness in embracing time-honored rights of upward mobility. To those adhering to this idealized mythos of Britishness, the wage crosscurrents manifested civilization-level convulsions over the sanctity of this identity. Would a revival of inflationary wage spirals represent the return of a debased 1970-style malaise eroding all that made Britain exceptional? Or might judicious labor price increases grease the economic engine, fueling a renaissance of quintessential British values around hard work, thrift, and upward mobility? Such existential preoccupations were never distant from Britain's cultural subconscious. From the World War II evacuees escaping the blasted cities for rural security, to the post-Suez reckoning with diminishing global clout, to the Brexit ruptures newly severing cherished insularity, these events flowed from a deeper wellspring of dread over the dissolution of Britishness itself. That cultural patrimony, the very intangible essence distinguishing true Britons from the rabble of globalized masses. To some, the resurgent wage inflation manifested a literal devaluation of that cherished identity. If compensations escalated unchecked, might the British fiscal disciplinarians' shaken propriety dribble into dilettantism and debauchery? Just as alarming, would higher salaries distend Britain's hallowed traditions of place, erasing the prudent delineations that demarcated the nation's intricate socio-economic strata? From the grandee contemplating his club's erosion to the working lad reconsidering his station's ceilings to the peeved pensioner railing at inflated fair-price sticker shocks, all intuited deeper civilizational regressions in naked wage insecurities. For the first, swelling pay emboldened the resentful sans-culottes to mistake their station. For the second, a wage windfall promised unmerited entry to elite preserves. For the third, higher salaries undercut the liveried pact sustaining their accustomed comforts in retirement. At each level, excessive wage growth threatened ancient codes demarcating Britannic personhood, from the uppermost echelons to the lumpen proletariat. For those perceiving themselves the protectors of Britain's atavistic soul, unrestricted wage latitude risked unstitching the very cultural fabric separating their own from the vulgarian herds without, those great undifferentiated masses lacking the island's discernment and preternatural instincts for studied order. This subliminal dread intermingled with more overt materialist trepidations over pay trends. Would unchecked wage increases erode the fiscal orthodoxies protecting Britain's steady-state social contracts? If so, the deliriant certitudes buoying each cohort, the leisured security of the nobility, the optimized lifestyle of the bourgeoisie, the modest assurances of the proletarian might all violently disassemble. Ultimately, these anxious subterranean vibrations distilled to a fervent wish for stasis, for preserving the eternal equilibria constituting Britishness as a constant and unchanging anthropological reality. For as each sentient mortal intuited, upwardly mobile salaries represented change itself, a dismantling of settled conventions facilitating the sweeping away of cherished worldviews, social compacts and hallowed cultural identities to be subsumed into the soulless, relentless dynamism of technocratic globalization. It was this mortal miasma of paranoia, pride and denial of entropy's inevitability that the wage discourse's disparate tributaries rushed to meet in a giant confluvium. From the highest gilded remittances cabled from British redoubts across the dominions, to the most abject pleadings for municipal rates assistance in woke-up Peckham, all encountered the wage specter as a reminder of impermanence. At the disquieting root, these existential anxieties over wages and identity insinuated the most profoundly human self-delusions, that nations and their attendant identities were something other than transitory social constructs, destined like all contrivances to ultimately fade and collapse under the entropic dismantling of time's ceaseless undertow. For Britain's collective consciousness had become so intertwined with the fable of its exceptional permanence, an island civilization impervious to the degradations afflicting lesser cultures, its ancestral ways preserved through the eternal vigilance of its guardians, that any tremor along the economic fault lines catalyzed existential dread. Wage stagnation whispered of stalled social mobility, of brittle class hierarchies attenuated until the underpinnings of status, stability, and aristocratic prerogative crumpled. Yet wage escalation prompted its own traumas, of inherited wisdoms subverted, of the ineffable Britishness diluted through upwardly mobile arrivistas breaching the sanctums. In this psychological house of mirrors, every fluctuation in compensation echoed as a derangement of the cosmic economic equilibria preserving the sacred isle's exceptionalism. For was not British greatness contingent on the steady-state flows of capital, hereditary entitlement, and deferential hierarchies? Any deviation from those stable currents represented a violation, an assault on the intangible ethers cohering British civilization into its hallowed identity. Thus, the wage dilemma slalomed through deeper sedimentary strata than mere inflation projections or unemployment figures. It signified the ongoing existential dramas over cultural obsolescence that had been reverberating since the day the first German dreadnoughts unfurled their brass rams against the wooden hulls of Britannic naval mastery. Ever since, the cycles of economic and political entropy had nipped relentlessly at the fringes of the idealized British identity, the Industrial Revolution's birthing Bermudic privations, the Bolshevism's threatening orderly harmonies of class consciousness, the Americanization defiling insular cultural sanctities with coca-colonialism. In each epoch, the English gentry and their cohorts intuited the demise of all that was profoundly British accelerating through some new economic appending or social dislocation. Waged labor itself had once been blasphemed as a vulgarian defilement imported from outlands, uprooting the timeless naturalism of obligated service to lord and land. Now the primordial dramas found new expression in fears over wage imbalances and inflation asymmetries, recapitulating those seismic shifts toward irreversible cultural dissolution. For if left unchecked, agitations in the labor compensation sphere risked dissolving the invisible auras, ritualized gradations, and delicately interdependent social stratifications constituting Britain's creedal mythos. At its core, the wage problem was a shibboleth, a coded signifier for immemorial tensions between the polarities of preservation versus profane change, of maintaining the British nation as an ethereal anthropological immanence, or surrendering its essential character to the irrepressible churnings of inevitability. This existential subtext lent the most banal discussions over inflation data and pay progressions a subterranean psychodrama redolent with cosmic implications. Behind every decimal point fluctuation, every incremental basis point adjustment, staggered the eternal battle for Britain's immutable soul, a Manichaean struggle between the sacred imperative of preserving ancestral wisdoms versus the inexorable dissolution signaled by any economic perturbation. For each side, the existential stakes could not remain higher or more starkly delineated. To the preservationists, stability and fealty to established rubrics were essential to upholding the sanctified national folklore, an identity contingent on a consecrated homeostasis ever pitting a discerning, noble Britishness against the barbaric disorders beyond the White Cliffs. Any acceleration of wage growth threatened the underpinnings of this Arcadian remove, the antechamber of virtues insulating the domains of the sceptred isle from benighted globalist entropy. Yet those agitating for greater wage dynamism espoused an equally sacrosanct vision, one transcending mere computations of marginal propensity to consume. For to these contrarian voices, higher wages embodied nothing less than the prospect of a revitalized national soul, a renaissance facilitating a new blossoming of quintessentially British attributes around advancement, entrepreneurialism, and the recapturing of long-atrophied upward mobility and generational self-actualization. From the council flat malcontent chafing at being rendered a permanent underclass, to the bright-eyed university graduate frustrated at fleeing for opportunity abroad, wage stagnation represented the betrayal of ancient covenants knitting Britons into a shared dream of meritocratic transcendence.